It's a thrill to have welcomed Jamie and Eric, and an equal thrill to now introduce our leadership panel, which will be chaired by Karin Fischer, who kind of needs no introduction, but Karin is a higher education, international education journalist extraordinaire with the Chronicle of Higher Education and with Latitudes, her own newsletter. We have Robin Shields, who we kindly heard from earlier in the session on video, and now he's here for reals. And so he'll be on the panel, as well as Daniel Obst, President and CEO of AFS, which has really taken a leadership role in addressing carbon emissions in a big, bold way. And last but not least, Janet Ilieva, of Education Insight in the UK. Janet is, I think it's safe to say, a world expert in transnational education, doing things sort of outside the box, I guess we could say. So without any further ado, I'm really pleased to turn it over to Karin. And just as a housekeeping note, we are going to keep this session to approximately 35 to 40 minutes, even though that means we'll run over time a little bit, because we think people would want that. So without ado, turn it over to Karin and team.
Hi to everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you all today. You know, as Eddie said, we really hope to have kind of a diverse sort of selection of viewpoints and experiences here. We have people who are practitioners. We have some real academic experts in the field, and I like to think of myself as an interested observer and chronicler of these things. The way this is going to work is we're going to give some sort of lightning keynotes. So each of our three panelists is going to talk for about 5 minutes, and then we really want to have a conversation. I think we're interested in thinking about both sustainability and environmental impact in international education in the time of COVID, but also we're going to try, as much as that's possible these days, to think beyond the immediate and talk about the long term. And as always, the Q&A is open, and I'll be trying to keep one eye on it. And so please, if there are things that you hope we all can address, I hope you put some questions in there. So as Eddie said, we are short on time. I don't want to waste time with preamble. So why don't I turn it over first to Robin for his remarks.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks. It's so nice to be speaking with everyone, and thanks, Karin, for chairing this session. So I'll just briefly introduce myself and share some thoughts on CANIE so far. Most of my work has been kind of highlighting the problem of climate change in international higher education, kind of maybe pointing out the elephant in the room, as Anne said, and it's often an uncomfortable subject because there's so much that's good about international higher education. People are uncomfortable to talk about the problems of climate change and that we don't really have an answer here. But what I've really liked about CANIE is I think there's such a sense of the future and beyond the problems, kind of what are the solutions. So I've enjoyed hearing what people have said today. I think that the problem of climate change and the future, especially now with the coronavirus crisis, creates a lot of uncertainty. As Anne's presentation said, there's anxiety about climate change among many young people. I've heard about 25% of young people reported in a survey having lost sleep over anxiety from climate change. So the future is very uncertain, but with that, it also means that it's open and we can change it and we can shape it. And so that's why an event like CANIE is so uncertain. And I think what I've learned recently is that no matter how much we think we know the future, it's always uncertain and it never turns out how we expect it will. So I never would have guessed, I don't know about you all, but even in February, I was thinking this coronavirus thing will blow over and I'll be fine. I mean, I'm relatively lucky, but you know, it's changed the world quite significantly. So the future doesn't turn out as we think it would. And also, as William Gibson, who's kind of a sci-fi author, has said, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So a lot of what's going to be the future of international higher education is happening in places like CANIE. So there's a lot to be excited about, I suppose. And one final quote on the future comes from a movie that shaped my thinking about the future when I was young, Back to the Future, the trilogy. And the future was always seen as kind of optimism, you know, things would be better. And Doc Brown, one of the main characters, ends the whole trilogy by telling by saying your future is whatever you make of it, so make it a good one. So CANIE's a great place to kind of make the future of international higher education a good one.
Thanks, Robin. Perhaps now I can turn to Janet.
Thank you. Thank you, Karin, and thank you, Eddie, for the kind introductions. I feel I've had a massive upgrade there in Eddie's very kind introduction. I'm very honored to join this panel and very grateful for the opportunity to contribute to such an important conversation. And if I can pick up on one of Robin's points about CANIE is the future, and I would also argue transnational education is the future in a very strong way, and I shall articulate this point a little bit better. But perhaps just take a step back and define what I mean by transnational education. Simplistically, this is the provision of higher education outside of the home country of the institution, and examples include online, distance learning, the international branch campuses, for example. So about 60% of the UK's international students are actually based in their home country or in their home region. This equates to about 700,000 international students. As such, the reliance on physical mobility is significantly lower compared to traditional forms of international education, for example. And I guess another argument that makes CANIE resonate very strongly with me is if we look at the UNESCO data, the globally mobile students, they only represent about 2% of the world's higher education students. Transnational education actually equips institutions with the means to reach significantly larger proportions of students beyond this 2% of globally mobile students. I also think that there is a strong sustainability agenda there, and this is very much in relation to access. And by access, I've got kind of two interpretations of access. Access to an international degree, but in a much more cost-effective way, but also access to higher education in general. Traditionally, transnational education has evolved to absorb unmet demand for local higher education. And whilst the traditional forms of transnational education were like physical outposts of campuses overseas, I guess over the past couple of decades, we're seeing increasingly collaborative forms of transnational education provision where so more than one institution, 2 or 3 are coming together to collectively develop a course which is locally relevant. So in addition to access to local students, or in addition to bringing education where the students are, there is also quite a significant component of capacity development with local staff. Why am I saying, or why am I arguing that the future looks very much like acceleration of transnational education? And I think COVID has triggered something that, I mean, apart from the negatives and all the challenges that universities are grappling with, COVID has actually pushed them to think in a different way, to engage with students in a different way. Online learning has normalized online tuition, for example. Whilst I'm not saying that online learning will be a substitute for on-campus face-to-face teaching, I think we're likely to see blended forms, and there will be quite a huge variations in terms between blended components of learning and still face-to-face on-campus experiences. But also, as we have this conversation now, the world is very slowly sliding into a global recession, which is quite scary, and which the IMF compares to the Great Depression of the 1930s. So while domestic demand for higher education is counter-cyclical because of weaker labor prospects for students, as such, we expect to see much greater demand for domestic higher education. It's the opposite with regard to international student demand, because the purchase power of the middle classes will be significantly reduced. And as such, students are likely to seek cheaper, more cost-effective alternatives that are closer to home, and possibly either in their home country or in their home region. So this is actually building on a trend that I've been observing over the past 20 years. Again, if I can just refer to the very helpful data that the UNESCO Institute of Statistics is publishing, international global mobility towards North America and Western Europe was 64%. So 64% of the globally mobile students went to study to North America and Western Europe in 1998. At the moment, it's just over half. So over the space of 18, 19 years, there has been about 12% decline in mobility towards the traditional study destinations. But other regions are enjoying increasing appeal, such as East Asia, such as Central and Eastern Europe, such as Middle East and North Africa, particularly countries in the Gulf states. So I think what basically COVID is indirectly impacting is triggering much greater student flows towards regions where the students are actually coming from. And talking about regional mobility, I see this being to a degree accelerated by strong transnational education provision. And the way that higher education institutions will maintain their engagement with these audiences that most likely won't be able to afford into full international degree would be by reaching out to them, by bringing their offering to those particular regions and working collaboratively with countries in the region, particularly institutions and are like-minded or not that like-minded, but universities that think like them, and universities that they can actually build relationships and partnerships with. And I shall end on that point and possibly pick up some of the other issues in the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. Daniel?
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for including me and AFS in this discussion. Congratulations to the organizers. I really have to say this is such an important event, and the time for action is now. And just like Robin said, to me, the most important piece in this is it's our job to shape the future we want to see. So, and I think that also relates a lot to how we react to whatever COVID is doing to us as international education community members. I want to give a brief introduction and talk really about the reset piece in the title of this, because AFS has pressed the reset button a couple times in our history. So now most of you probably know AFS for our high school exchange programs. We exchange about 12,000 participants every year around the world. We have 60 AFS national organizations. We're a volunteer-driven organization with 50,000 volunteers around the world. But the origin of AFS was in World War I, and we were the American Field Service then that had volunteer ambulance drivers who went to Europe to transport wounded civilians and soldiers. And so the real values that were part of the organization were always around volunteerism, civil courage, and serving where it was needed. And so after the Second World War, that was kind of the first big pivot of AFS. And the question really was, what is needed to create a more peaceful world? And so at AFS back then, 75 years ago, the answer was, we need more mutual understandings. We need to break down the barriers of fear and hate, and therefore exchange programs were started. Now, 75 years later, the world looks quite different and a lot has changed. It's teenagers who started a huge movement to champion climate action, but they're protesting not only for climate action, but they're also protesting for a more just and peaceful world. But to me, the interesting piece is that peace no longer means only the absence of war, but it also means a more fair and sustainable world. And so for us, the question was, what is needed now? at AFS and in the world, and how do we respond to it? So a couple of years ago, we hit the reset button again and adopted a new strategy, which now in hindsight was quite prescient. And our main goal really was to develop more responsible citizens through intercultural learning to take action in their community and around the world. So we call them active global citizens. And so how we are doing this right now is really in two levels. We're taking a dual approach to transitioning our work to a more sustainable future, both at the macro and the micro level. At the macro level, essentially, it's all about becoming more sustainable as an organization. So it's about our processes and procedures. As Eddie mentioned earlier, we made a big pledge last year to offset all our travel emissions from our flagship exchange programs as standard practice. These are 12,000 exchange participants every year, so it's quite a lot. It's of course only one part in a multi-step process to become more carbon neutral as an organization. We've started piloting new ways of travel. So can we have more train travel instead of plane travel in Europe? It's a little bit more complicated when you're dealing with minors because you have duty of care issues and so on, but we're actively working on those issues. One of our alums is the CEO of South Pole, which is an amazing carbon financing organization. So we're now talking with them exactly how we can offset our carbon emissions and really also engage our students and volunteers in actually beyond just like ticking the box, but really seeing how climate change affects real life activities on the ground and really building that into the programs that we have. And that is kind of the second piece of our approach, is really about the content. So how do we best prepare active global citizens so they become change makers in the world? And so this is, for me, also the second part of this panel discussion, and the topic is about leadership. So how do we create the next generation of leaders who take action in their community? And just a couple examples here, we are partnering now with the University of Pennsylvania Center for Social Impact Strategy on creating a new curriculum for all our exchange participants on social impact and how you become a social entrepreneur. So really providing them with the tools to do that. We're adding new programs that are very dedicated on climate change and sustainable issues. We have a new series of workshops for schools that are locally offered called Effect Plus. We've reached almost 10,000 participants in 200 schools in 20 countries around the world, all focused on sustainable development goals and so on. So for us, really, our belief is that as educational organizations, as mission-driven organizations, we can't sit on the sidelines of these conversations. And so if we are organizations that are made up of global citizens and that are intending to build global citizens, we must model our own values. So this is really where our pledge comes in and where we see our future as an organization.
I wonder if I could begin actually right where Daniel left off, which is talking about empowering individuals. I think quite often within international education, the conversations can tend to default to the higher level, to the university, to the organization, to the to higher ed broadly. And I wonder, and maybe I can start with you, Daniel, since you started to touch on this, but what are some ways that we can empower individuals, so students, but also people within the international community who are committed to and who care about these issues? How can we help them be empowered and have an effect on these things?
Yeah, it's a really important issue. And I feel so often in this discussion, it is largely about ticking the box, right? Doing the right thing as an organization, but really not taking the next level. From our perspective, pretty much everything is around local leadership, right? Like, how do we really prepare people who are responsible citizens in their own local communities? And so that means having the right tools. But from the AFS perspective, what is super important to us, it's core to our mission, is the intercultural learning. So you're not going to solve any global challenges or deal with any interpersonal or intercultural issues without the skills and tools around intercultural learning. And that goes not just for global engagements, but also for local engagement. So for us, it is always about the content knowledge and the experiential piece around engagement with others, but it's also the very intentional intercultural learning that is necessary if you really want to empower future leaders. So that's core to AFS.
And Robin, I wonder if I can ask you a similar question about agency and kind of helping people seed it and find it.
Yeah, I think it's often hard for people who are in large institutions and they have specific goals that are set for them in their role, and they're wondering, what can I do about climate change? It's a difficult situation. I think one thing that we can all do is just start to talk amongst ourselves in forums such as this. So being the one who raises the issue, is there a way that we can consider climate change in whatever new program we're starting? You know, can we, if we're bringing people from abroad, can we be sure that we're talking about climate change while they're here, so that hopefully over the long term, this contributes to part of the solution? I think we need, as a field, we need success stories of new innovative programs in internationalization. So now is the time for students who are traveling by rail in Europe to post something on TikTok that shows how much fun it was when they were on the train, rather than, you know, crammed in an airport somewhere. So that's something we can all do, is just through social media, highlight what we're doing. And I suppose for many of us over the next few years, we have a new opportunity to show what's possible in our roles. We're not going to have the same expectations, and we're not going to run programs the same way as we have in the past. So the question will be, do we revert back after this period to what we were doing before? Or maybe in this period, we've shown something else is possible, and we can continue that as we move forward.
You know, that's a really great point, Robin, because one thing I've been thinking about is that it really felt like this was a moment in which this conversation about sustainability and international education was really beginning to blossom and flower. And I have been wondering myself about where do we go from here? Is this going to be something where suddenly all we can talk about is coronavirus, and these conversations and focus on climate action sort of take a back seat? Or does this somehow make us think, which is I think perhaps a little bit what you're suggesting, of ways to be innovative, and it ends up spurring that? And I wonder if I can just kind of draw you out a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. The future's in the balance, in a sense. Is after the next few years, do we say, well, that was difficult, now let's go back to what we were doing before? And there'll be a lot of pressures to do that. There'll be financial pressures to bring in new revenue streams from universities that have had a difficult time. But there's also the possibility for real change. And so it's very much up to us as to which of those two things happens, to go back to the Doc Brown quote, I guess, being the future being what you make of it. Innovation is key here, definitely. And we've heard some really great stories today of people running exchanges in new ways, and probably not just trying to virtualize existing exchange opportunities, but maybe imagine something which is altogether new. A new way of doing internationalization, I think, is probably going to be the most convincing way to grow in this time.
And Janet, I'd be curious about your thoughts. You raised the issue of transnational education in your remarks, and I wonder if you as well see this moment as a way to kind of help seed new approaches, or if you worry we're just going to get focused on the pandemic and not think about these kind of underlying structural issues within higher education.
Yes, I do think that the pandemic has triggered some innovative ways to do things, different ways of doing things. And transnational education has provided the tools to do things differently. And it is no surprise that institutions that were best prepared to switch to online were the ones with strong online provision, because they had the infrastructure to switch to such provision, although it required massive effort. This is not to say it was easier for them, it was just as hard, but they could easily deploy infrastructure to utilize by teaching in a different way. But also having the connections in countries and to engage with students in a different way. I guess I gave them this additional flexibility to continue with their teaching. I'm hearing examples for example, the University of Coventry is considering whether some of the students can possibly start the course in their home country with a local education partner. And then when the health situation improves, they can switch to the course in the UK. Obviously, this is not a firm decision. It's just one of the possible scenarios that universities are talking about. But also going ahead with online lectures and having face-to-face tutorials is another possibility that teaching can take place. In the space of transnational education, I guess there are some quite a few examples. The one that comes to mind is virtual exam boards. So instead of the academics traveling to the country where the education provision is happening, they can actually facilitate it in a virtual way, which is still quite labor intensive in a way, but it has a significant lower carbon footprint. And even without a shadow of a doubt, I don't think that when the pandemic is over, universities are going to switch back to flying to facilitate or to participate in exam boards or have their quality assurance meetings in the country of education provision. So I think that these new practices are quite likely to stay. They're much greener, they're much more environmental. And I guess one of the developments that I would really love to see is when students choose the modules they have to do, and each module has credits attached to it, why not each module have carbon footprint attached to it, just as means to inform the student about the total impact. It's not just on their career, but on the environment as well.
I think I've been thinking about this question. I just saw it pop up in the Q&A feed, and I wonder if I can pose this to you, Janet. I mean, I think for so long, mobility, particularly of students, has been seen as kind of almost the central tenet, is almost synonymous with international education. And I wonder if there are ways, you know, when people in this field have spent, you know, generations, quite literally, talking about the value of gaining cultural exchange and understanding through crossing borders, what are some ways to reframe the conversation so that it's seen as being of you know, transnational education or virtual exchange are seen as being you know, having equal benefits?
Yes, I guess it's embracing change, and I'm going to use a quote that from Jane Knight that she used in an interview I had with her about 3 years ago, and it is: international higher education is proactive for change. It's it's proactive to opportunity. It's reactive to change, but proactive to opportunities. And I think that if we embrace international higher education in all its facets, in all its shapes, because it's not, student mobility is the most visible one, it's the one that we can measure, it's most tangible. We see the students on campus. But in addition to that, we have the mobility of education programs, we have mobility of institutions, mobility of research. Collaborations are happening across borders anyway, and these are all connections there that complement an international experience or a student experience. I quite liked the reference made earlier by Daniel and Robin about, we're talking about intercultural competencies. And I guess this global fluency is another expression I've come across. The Vice Chancellor of the UK's University of Nottingham used that expression a short while ago, and I really liked it because it's this global fluency that people develop irrespective where they are. And I think student mobility will continue to be there, but it will look differently. Maybe students will no longer travel for 4 years and they'll be flying back and from to the country they come from in the space of 4 or 5 years. Their mobility options may be a bit shorter. There may be a bit fewer flights involved in that. I'm not saying that it will completely disappear. It will be there, but it will change its shape.
Daniel, maybe I can turn back to you and ask you much the same question. I mean, I know you obviously have a crystal ball in the other room. I mean, what are you seeing? How do you think mobility and international education might be different on the other side of these things?
Yeah, it's interesting. So from my perspective, I think it's always most important to start with the mission of your organization, whatever it may be, right? And I feel like at crisis points or important pivot points to really ask, are there new ways, better ways to meet our mission? And I think what we're kind of using as our internal motto is build back better, right? Because to a certain extent, there are things that will be really impacted. Our work won't be exactly the same. I would very much miss a world in which there's no real exchange, where you meet a person face to face in a different country and you experience that. So from my perspective, I would never want to see that go away, but it always was an issue with access. Who has access to these kind of experiences? And I feel if this is now forcing everyone to think about how else can we provide really meaningful intercultural, international engagement that may not be part of travel, but that is more than just a cooking class online in a different country, I think that would be a huge contribution to the field. And I see a lot of these initiatives starting to take shape because you just have to deliver real educational content now in different ways. And so I think that's really positive.
Do you, Robin, see similar silver linings?
Yeah, I would echo.
Building back better, yeah.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what's been said. I agree with the question, and that physical mobility is kind of the gold standard in the field, and things like the junior year abroad in the US are kind of a cultural institution, and it's going to be really hard to change that. So probably the key is to look for new forms of international education that don't have kind of a deficit model. So they're not trying to do something equivalent to the physical mobility just virtually, but rather are doing something completely different. We don't want kind of low carbon, to use an analogy, we don't want low carbon international education to be like tofurkey is to a plant-based diet. Like it doesn't taste very good. It's just trying to mimic the real thing, if you like. We want it to be something that really shows off the flavors that are possible, I suppose. And so it might mean students doing collaborative projects together at the same time. If we had groups of students now perhaps promoting behavior around social distancing in their communities simultaneously and showing what they're doing, that wouldn't really be possible through physical mobility, as far as I know. And so there are things that we can do virtually that we can't do physically, and that's probably where we want to focus.
Can I add one more thing, Karin, if I may? One thing that we've seen, so we had to repatriate about 6,000 or 7,000 students, which was a logistical challenge in itself. But what we did very quickly, we have this global competence certificate that was actually developed for higher education students. Within 2 weeks, we reprogrammed it so it was for high school participants, and that it was basically an off-boarding process for the vaguely traumatic experience of having to cut your program short to return home. So we have 6,000 kids from 60 countries around the world enrolled in this. And to me, the most exciting piece there is almost all exchanges are bilateral in nature. And this is like, we have a global community of people talking synchronously and asynchronously about this global experience that they all had that was shared. And to me, there's huge opportunity in figuring out how we can have more of these truly global conversations rather than just the bilateral ones.
I mean, I think that's a really great point, because I do think sometimes in the same way that we use mobility as being synonymous with intercultural competency, we do also, think of when we talk about international, we really do mean bilateral. And so I wonder, Janet, if, to get your thoughts about this silver linings piece of this. I liked your idea about global fluency. And I wonder, are there ways in which you think that can be, pushed in a different way that is robust and meaningful for students?
Yes, I think the silver lining there is green. And by saying that, I do mean that the way that higher education is going to go ahead is in a much more collaborative way. the engagement between institutions will become even stronger. There will be quite significant shifts in the making in terms of students and student flows, what they demand, how can we respond to global challenges. And the way to actually address it is through partnerships. There has been mention a few times of bilateral, but I guess the way forward is multilateral. But we have more than 2 institutions from more than 2 regions coming together to provide quite a unique experience to their learners, whether it's through virtual mobility or physical mobility, with students having greater control over the study modules that they're doing. But I guess the way I want to dream about higher education is very much student-centered, around their wants, about their circumstances, about their environment, and actually reaching a little bit broader to that is the community of the student that the student comes from, and being able to cater to all these idiosyncrasies that different communities across the globe have and bring, because it's actually enriching the conversation that we are having now. And the whole notion about that it's no longer the students going to university, is the universities reaching out to the students and bringing education to wherever they are, as such physical proximity is much less relevant now, and well, it will become even less relevant in future. So if I could just bring kind of my talk back to where we started, yes, I do see the silver lining being very much on the sustainability front, collaborations and partnerships.
We've got just a few minutes left now, unfortunately, but I do want to, I'm always kind of guilty as a reporter of monopolizing the questions. And so I wanted to pull another one that I've noticed in the Q&A queue, which is, and I think this commenter makes a point, which is probably true, which is often people who believe in something, whether it's in the importance of sustainability or the value of global education, often we tend to talk to the converted. And so this person was asking, how can we talk to the folks who don't necessarily buy in to these things? And I think that could be both within your institutions, within higher education, but also how do we talk to people within the general public about these things? Jen, I see you nodding your head. You have some thoughts first?
I think it's basically bringing back the students with their environment, and we can do that in a much better way, much more impactful way, by basically reaching out where the students are, because it is a way to engage with the local context, and the best way to do that is through local partners that know the local cultural context, the local economic context. They know the environment better. And the promotion of true collaboration is likely to happen in equal partnerships, where we don't have a dominant institution or dominant partners, but it's truly mutual, it's truly collaborative. And I do believe that only in this way, where the benefits and the participation is truly mutual, we can have this much wider impact on communities and societies that are virtually beyond our reach. And if I can just add another dimension to that conversation, I don't think I've mentioned enough about, if at all, about internationalization at home agenda. And I do things through the virtual means and through transnational education. There is internationalization at home, kind of on several campuses. It's in the partner institution to a degree, because there are students that are doing an international degree and are engaged with a collaborative program, but equally impact on the domestic institution that is engaged in these partnerships, in these collaborations, because this teaching doesn't happen in its own. there is a whole student body behind it in the home country. So I think a strong component there, it cannot happen in isolation from the internationalization at home agenda.
Well, I just wanted to ask then one big picture, last final question, and to invite each of you to weigh in. I feel like today, you know, May 2020, when we talk about the future, it's whenever there's a vaccine and we can all start to get back to what was normal beforehand. And I wonder if I can ask you to cast your eyes a little bit more forward than that, and to tell me sort of what you're thinking might happen in terms of international education and specifically about sustainability within international education. What do you see happening, you know, if we were to regroup a decade from now and have this conversation? What will we be talking about then?
I could jump in. I could start off. Yeah. I mean, I think I would like to be surprised, actually. So I would like to see something in 10 years from now that we can't even imagine today. I hope it would be lower carbon. I hope it would go beyond how we consider virtual education today or transnational education, and maybe approach things entirely differently. So that's very vague. But I think sometimes the best outcomes are the ones that you can't even imagine today. But just to wrap up, I think the people in attendance today and some of the videos we've seen from students are exactly the right type of people who will come up with these ideas that today are just kind of simmering underneath the surface.
If I can just echo what Robin said there, is that the real drivers of change will be the students. They will demand different ways of tuition, more environment-friendly types of education provision, and universities would have to face that, have to respond. I mean, interestingly, at the moment, a lot of the responses are either driven by cost efficiency, by making education tuition much kind of more cost effective, trying to make it sustainable, but from financial sustainability point of view. Whereas the environment, I think, is equally important. So decisions have to kind of bear both in mind, both components. It's the environmental impact, but also the financial impact. And students will demand the latter. So I think that we'll see increasing pressure on universities to respond to that. Students have an amazing civic engagement. So I don't think they will let institutions not address the issue. And my other point is about this autumn and in 10 years. I think that a significant advantage in the current situation would be on side of institutions that have a very clear vision of what the 10 years look for them. And their autumn response has to be part of that vision, has to be a step in the direction that brings them closer on what is to come in 10 years. Otherwise, it's a step back.
And for me, I love the surprise. I would love to be surprised too. I hope we are surprised that we're not in a conversation of whether it's national or global or local or global, that we are in a world where people really truly see our interdependence and where we listen with empathy and where we have a much better way of talking across difference. And I feel if this is what this crisis, but also the need for more engagement is pushing, I think that would be a better world.
Well, thanks to all three of you, and thanks for those of you who stuck with us and got to raise some really great points. I do think just to echo all three of you, I mean, there is some ways in which a crisis does kind of concentrate attention and not to be cliched, but can lead to innovation. And I think it will be really revealing to see kind of how some of the conversations that I do hear happening within institutions and organizations about, thinking, taking this time to think in a far-reaching way if they can bear fruit. So with that, let me turn it over to our organizers, and they'll be wrapping it up. Thanks, everyone.